The German Wehrmacht of World War II was built on a foundation of operational artistry and tactical excellence. Its doctrine, Bewegungskrieg or maneuver warfare, emphasized speed, decentralization, and the decisive application of force at a critical point, the Schwerpunkt. This philosophy was embodied in the Blitzkrieg and relied on the initiative of junior officers and highly trained specialist troops to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. For the German soldier, artillery was a vital component of this system, but it played a specific supporting role. The German approach to artillery was one of precision and centralized control. Fire was typically directed by an observer, often at the battalion level, and was intended to be a scalpel, a precise instrument to soften a specific strong point, break up an enemy formation, or enable the advance of the infantry and panzers. The American approach, codified in the Field Manual 105, was fundamentally different. While the U.S. Army understood and utilized maneuver, its overwhelming strength lay in its industrial capacity and its ability to manage and deliver firepower on a scale previously unimaginable. American military doctrine viewed artillery not as a supporting arm, but as the primary killer on the battlefield. The goal was not merely to suppress the enemy, but to annihilate him. This was not a philosophy of the scalpel. It was a philosophy of the sledgehammer. The core principle was volume over precision, and it was enabled by a technological and procedural advantage that the Germans never managed to overcome: the flexible and decentralized use of radio communication. At the heart of this system was the Fire Direction Center, FDC. This was a revolutionary concept. When a forward observer, embedded with an infantry company, spotted a target, he did not have to request fire through a long, hierarchical chain of command. Instead, he communicated directly via radio with the FDC of an artillery battalion. The FDC, staffed with teams of soldiers using specialized graphical computing tools like the firing chart and the graphical firing table, could take this call for fire, compute the firing data for an entire battalion of guns, 18 howitzers or more, and have them all firing on the target in a matter of minutes. This process, from call to impact, could be executed in 3 to 5 minutes for a pre-planned target, and even less for an immediate fire-for-effect mission. This contrasted sharply with German practice. German forward observers often lacked direct radio links to their batteries and had to relay requests through command channels, a process that could take 20 minutes or more. While the Germans were masters of pre-registering and planning fires for a set-piece offensive, they were far less flexible in reacting to the fluid, unexpected engagements that defined the battlefield. The American system, by delegating authority to a low-level lieutenant, the forward observer, and a technical team, the FDC, could bring down a storm of steel anywhere on the battlefield with terrifying speed. The psychological impact of this disparity was profound. A German unit could be maneuvering, believing it had achieved local surprise, only to find itself, within minutes, engulfed in a deluge of high explosive and steel fragmentation. There was no warning, no gradual build-up of fire. It was a sudden, violent, and impersonal event. The American artillery did not duel with German batteries in the traditional sense. It sought to overwhelm them. A single call from a forward observer could trigger a time-on-target, TOT mission, a meticulously timed barrage where the shells from multiple battalions, fired from different locations and at different trajectories, would all land on the target simultaneously. This gave the defenders no time to hear the incoming rounds and take cover. The first sign of the barrage was the world itself exploding. For the veteran German soldier on the Eastern Front, used to the massive but often predictable bombardments of the Soviet Army, the American artillery was something new and deeply unsettling. The Soviets used volume, but their fires were often rigid and slow to adjust. The Americans combined volume with a responsiveness that felt omnipresent. It created a pervasive sense of being watched, of being hunted by an invisible enemy that could summon destruction from miles away at a moment's notice. This was the opening phase of the German education in American firepower, a realization that their tactical prowess was being neutralized by a system that operated on a different plane of warfare altogether. The terrifying speed of the American artillery system was only one component of its effectiveness. Its true destructive power was realized through its sheer mass and the sophisticated organization that delivered it. The United States fielded an artillery arsenal that was not only technologically advanced, but was also deployed in a coordinated, layered structure that could dominate a battlefield dozens of miles deep. For the German soldier, this translated into an experience of being under constant, inescapable fire from which no terrain, no fortification, and no unit cohesion offered guaranteed safety. The workhorse of the U.S. Army was the 105mm M2A1 howitzer. This weapon was the perfect embodiment of American design philosophy, reliable, mobile, and capable of a high rate of fire. Each 105mm howitzer battalion consisted of 3 firing batteries of 4 guns each, for a total of 12 guns. A standard U.S. infantry division had 3 direct support battalions of 105mm howitzers, 36 tubes, organic to its structure. But the system did not stop there. At the corps level, additional artillery units were held in a general support role. These included battalions of the heavier 155mm M1 Long Tom howitzer and the massive 8-inch M1 howitzer. A single U.S. Army corps could easily concentrate the fire of over 300 guns on a single sector. This structure created a hierarchy of fire. The 105mm battalions were directly tied to the infantry regiments they supported, handling immediate close-range targets. The 150mm and 8-inch units could be used to engage deeper targets, enemy headquarters, artillery positions, supply dumps, and reserve concentrations. This meant that a German unit, from the frontline company to the divisional command post miles behind the lines, existed within the same lethal envelope. The front line was not a defined place. It was simply the area where the American infantry happened to be at that moment. Everything behind them was a free fire zone. The volume of shells this system could deliver was industrial in scale. A single 105mm howitzer could sustain a rate of fire of 3-4 rounds per minute. In a fire-for-effect mission from a full battalion, this meant 36 to 48 shells impacting on a target area every 60 seconds. During major offensives, this scale escalated dramatically. In the preparation for the Operation Cobra breakout in Normandy, July 1944, over 1,500 artillery pieces fired a coordinated barrage for nearly 2 hours, dumping more than 50,000 shells onto a relatively narrow front. This was not a bombardment. It was a geological event. German survivors described the landscape as being ploughed by the shells, with trenches caved in, vehicles flipped, and men driven insane by the concussive violence. This volume was sustained by a logistical effort that dwarfed anything the Germans could achieve. The United States produced over 11 million tons of artillery ammunition during the war. American supply lines, the famed Red Ball Express and its successors, ensured that artillery units were rarely, if ever, constrained by a lack of shells. A German artillery officer captured in Normandy expressed his astonishment at this, noting that his own batteries had been limited to a handful of shells per day due to Allied air interdiction and industrial shortfalls, while the Americans fired seemingly without limit. The coordination extended beyond howitzers. The American system fully integrated mortars, tanks, and naval gunfire into its net. A forward observer could call for fire from the 81mm or 4.2-inch mortars of his own infantry battalion, the direct fire of a company of M4 Sherman tanks, or, in coastal areas, the 5-inch or 6-inch guns of a cruiser or destroyer offshore. This created a seamless continuum of firepower from a few hundred yards to over 15 miles away. A German counterattack might be spotted by an observation plane, engaged by corps-level 150mm guns as it formed up, shelled by divisional 105s as it advanced, blasted by tank fire at medium range, and finally finished off by mortars and machine guns at the point of contact. There was no safe space to assemble, no safe route to approach, and no safe way to retreat. The German soldier was not just fighting the American infantry in front of him, he was fighting the very environment which had been weaponized against him. The organizational and doctrinal superiority of American artillery was amplified by a suite of technological and procedural innovations that gave it a decisive edge in accuracy, flexibility, and survivability. While the German artillery arm was competent and often equipped with excellent pieces, it was hampered by technological stagnation, material shortages, and a command structure that failed to keep pace with the American integration of technology and tactics. The result was a battlefield where American gunners could shoot faster, move quicker, and hit harder than their adversaries, all while being far more difficult to locate and destroy. The most critical piece of technology was the radio. The American artillery's entire rapid response system was built on the reliability and proliferation of the SCR-609 and SCR-610 radio sets used by forward observers and fire direction centers. These were rugged, portable, and had sufficient range to maintain the vital link between the front line and the guns. Crucially, they operated on dedicated artillery nets free from the congestion that often plagued German communications. German artillery, by contrast, relied more heavily on telephone lines, which were vulnerable to being cut by preparatory barrages, and their radio equipment was less plentiful and often less reliable. This communications advantage fed directly into the American mastery of a technique that became the scourge of the Wehrmacht, the time on target, 2T. As previously mentioned, a TOT was a complex fire mission where the firing data for every gun in the barrage was calculated so that all projectiles from 105mm to 8-inch would land in the target area simultaneously. The mathematical complexity of this, accounting for different shell velocities, gun positions, and atmospheric conditions, was handled efficiently by the FDCs. The psychological and physical effect was devastating. A standard barrage gave soldiers a few seconds of warning, the sound of the guns firing miles away, followed by the rising scream of incoming shells. This allowed seasoned troops to dive for cover. A TOT offered no warning. The first sound was the mass detonation of dozens of shells, instantly obliterating the target zone. It was used with deadly effect against troop concentrations, command posts, and most chillingly for the Germans, against their own artillery batteries. Counter-battery fire, the art of locating and destroying enemy artillery, was another area where American technology reigned supreme. The US developed and deployed highly effective sound-ranging and flash-ranging units. These specialized teams used arrays of microphones and cameras to triangulate the position of enemy guns the moment they fired. The coordinates were then rushed to an FDC, which could initiate a TOT or a massed fire-for-effect mission on the German battery within minutes. The high rate of fire of American guns meant they could deliver a crushing counter-battery strike and then shoot and scoot before an ineffective German response could be organized. German after-action reports consistently complain of the speed and accuracy of American counter-battery fire, which made it exceptionally dangerous for their gunners to support their own infantry. The guns themselves were also superior. The 104 mm M1 Long Tom was one of the finest field guns of the war, with a range of over 14 miles, outranging its German counterpart, the 15 cm SFH-18, by several thousand yards. This meant American heavy batteries could sit safely beyond the effective range of German counterfire. The 105 mm howitzer, while similar in capability to the German 10.5 cm FH-18, was lighter and more mobile, able to be towed by standard 2.5-ton trucks and quickly repositioned. German guns were often heavier and required specialized and increasingly scarce half-track prime movers. Finally, the ubiquity of the Jeep and the 2.5-ton truck cannot be overstated. American artillery was motorized to a degree the horse-drawn German artillery could never match. This granted unparalleled strategic and tactical mobility. An American artillery battalion could displace, move 20 miles, and be set up and firing from a new position in a fraction of the time it took a German unit. This made the American artillery arm a fluid, shifting, and ever-present threat. For the German soldier and commander, this technical and systemic edge created a profound sense of impotence. They were not being outfought in a fair duel. They were being systematically hunted and dismantled by a system that was more advanced, more responsive, and utterly relentless. The physical destruction wrought by American artillery was catastrophic, but its psychological impact was arguably even more decisive in breaking the fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht. Unlike the direct personal threat of an infantryman with a rifle or a tank, artillery fire was an impersonal, omnipresent force. It represented a form of warfare that negated individual courage, skill, and training. A German soldier could be a veteran of the Eastern Front, a master of camouflage and marksmanship, and his prowess meant nothing when a 155mm shell, called in by an unseen observer miles away, exploded 10 yards from his foxhole. This sense of helplessness was the cornerstone of the artillery's psychological terror. German after-action reports and soldiers' personal letters and diaries are filled with a specific and consistent vocabulary describing American artillery fire. They refer to it as Trommelfeuer, drumfire, Feuerwalzer, a rolling fire wave, or Eisenhagel, hail of iron. These terms evoke not just noise and destruction, but a sense of inescapable natural force. The noise itself was a weapon. Prolonged exposure to the concussive blasts, the shrieking of shells, and the constant, earth-shaking reverberations led to a high incidence of what was then called war neurosis, or shell shock. The symptoms were debilitating, uncontrollable trembling, catatonia, extreme anxiety, and a complete inability to function. While all armies suffered from this, the relentless, unpredictable nature of American fire made it a particularly acute problem for German units. A soldier might endure a 2-hour bombardment only to have a single, unexpected, harassing fire round land in his position every 10 minutes for the next 12 hours, denying him any rest or sense of security. This harassing and interdicting H&I fire was a deliberate psychological tactic. American artillery planners would systematically target known supply routes, crossroads, assembly areas, and even empty fields suspected of being potential staging areas throughout the night. The goal was not always to kill, but to prevent sleep, disrupt supply, and instill a constant state of nervous anticipation. The effect was a grinding, cumulative exhaustion that eroded unit cohesion far more effectively than a single, massive barrage. A company could be rendered combat ineffective without ever seeing an American infantryman, its men hollow-eyed, jumpy, and pushed to the brink of collapse from sleep deprivation and nerve-wracking tension. Perhaps the most demoralizing aspect was the randomness of the death it dealt. In a firefight, a soldier could identify a threat, take cover, and return fire. There was a sense of agency. In an artillery barrage, death was arbitrary. A shell fragment could kill the man in the next foxhole while leaving another unscathed. A direct hit could vaporize a group of men, leaving no trace. This random annihilation shattered the primary group loyalty, the bond with the men in one squad or platoon. That was the fundamental motivator for the German soldier. When a man's comrades could be instantly obliterated by a force he could not fight back against, the will to continue the fight crumbled. This psychological warfare extended to the command level. The effectiveness of American counter-battery fire and the use of TOT missions made it incredibly dangerous for German officers to assemble for briefings or for command posts to remain in one location for long. The decapitation of a unit's leadership by a sudden artillery strike was a common and devastating occurrence. The sense that they were being observed at all times, that any concentration of men or vehicles would be swiftly punished, forced German commanders into a defensive, reactive posture. They lost the initiative not just operationally but psychologically. The American artillery system created a pervasive climate of fear that stifled aggression and bred a fatalistic despair, perfectly encapsulated by the common German lament, "Der Feind hat uns immer im Visier. The enemy has us in his sights always." The theoretical and psychological advantages of American artillery were proven in the brutal laboratories of the European battlefields. Specific campaigns stand as stark monuments to its devastating effectiveness, illustrating how it systematically broke some of the best units the Wehrmacht could field. In the frozen hell of the Ardennes, the dark forests of the Hürtgen, and the final collapse along the Rhine, American firepower acted as the great equalizer, and often the decisive victor. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, 1944. This protracted, bloody battle became a nightmare of attrition where American tactical maneuver was often nullified by the dense terrain. In this environment, artillery was the primary tool of warfare. The American response was to use massive quantities of delayed fuse shells. These shells were set to detonate only after penetrating the forest canopy and the first few feet of soil. Upon explosion, they would create a massive subsurface cavity, uprooting giant trees and turning them into a deadly hail of wooden splinters. The effect was to transform the forest itself into a weapon against its defenders. German positions, which relied on the cover of the woods, were literally blown apart from below. The constant barrages made reinforcement and supply nearly impossible, and the psychological toll on the German defenders, trapped in a seemingly sentient landscape of falling trees and earth-shaking blasts, was immense. The Battle of the Bulge, 1944-45, the German Ardennes offensive, was the last, desperate gamble of the Wehrmacht in the West. It initially succeeded due to surprise, bad weather that grounded Allied air power, and the thinly held American front. However, when the weather cleared, the American artillery system demonstrated its full, terrifying potential. The initial German spearheads, particularly the 5th Panzer Army, made significant gains. But as they advanced, they became funneled into specific corridors, like the one toward the vital crossroads of Bastogne. Here, the Americans perfected the rolling box defense. This tactic involved surrounding advancing German units with a virtual box of continuous artillery fire. The sides and rear of the penetration were saturated with fire to prevent reinforcement and resupply, while the front was hammered to slow the advance. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, besieged in Bastogne, was supported by the entire artillery complement of the U.S. the 8th Corps. When the German commander, General von Leutnant, demanded the surrender of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply, "Nuts," was backed by the firepower of over 300 artillery pieces that pounded the encircling German forces relentlessly. The inability of the Germans to resupply their forward units, largely due to this interdiction fire, was a critical factor in the offensive's ultimate failure. Post-battle analysis showed that artillery fire was responsible for the majority of German tank and vehicle losses, and a huge percentage of their infantry casualties. The Colmar Pocket and the assault on the Rhine, 1945. In the final months of the war, American artillery had evolved into an instrument of breathtaking precision and mass. The reduction of the Colmar Pocket in Alsace, a stubborn German bridgehead, was a textbook example of coordinated firepower. Artillery observers used the high ground of the Vosges Mountains to direct fire with lethal accuracy. The crossing of the Rhine River involved one of the largest artillery preparations of the war in the West, with thousands of guns plastering the far bank to suppress German defences and allow the assault boats to cross. By this stage, German artillery was a spent force, its batteries destroyed, its ammunition depleted, and its crews demoralized. The sheer weight of American shells had physically and psychologically crushed their ability to respond in any meaningful way. In each of these cases, a common theme emerges. American artillery did not just support the infantry, it often was the battle. It was the constant defining factor that blunted German offensives, shattered their defenses, and methodically attrited their finest divisions into exhaustion and collapse. For the German soldier, these battles were not remembered as fights against men, but as ordeals spent under an unending storm of steel. By the spring of 1945, the verdict was in. The systematic application of American artillery power had proven to be one of the most decisive elements of the war in the European theatre. Its legacy is found not only in the operational results, but in the candid admissions of the German commanders who were defeated by it, and in the long-term influence it had on modern military doctrine. The German High Command, often dismissive of American tactical leadership, was unanimous in its respect and dread of the U.S. Army's artillery arm. The post-war U.S. Army Historical Division conducted an extensive series of interviews with captured German generals. Their testimony is remarkably consistent. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff in the West, stated, "The artillery was the outstanding feature of the American Army. The speed with which the Americans placed defensive fires in front of our attacking infantry was truly astonishing." General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, architect of the Bulge offensive, wrote, "The Americans' greatest advantage was their artillery. Its flexibility and speed of reaction exceeded anything we could do. Their use of time on target was a terrifyingly effective technique." Perhaps the most telling comment came from General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, who, when asked to identify the single greatest factor in his defeat, simply replied, "The artillery." This respect was born from a stark numerical and industrial reality. The United States produced over 7,105 mm howitzers and 4,150 mm howitzers during the war. It manufactured over 11 million tons of artillery ammunition. Germany, by contrast, was never able to match this output, and its artillery arm was increasingly crippled by a lack of fuel, prime movers, and ammunition in the war's final years. But the difference was not merely quantitative, it was systemic. The American integration of communications, forward observation, and flexible fire control was a generation ahead of the German model. The legacy of this system is profound. The American approach to artillery in World War II, decentralized, radio-dependent, and focused on volume and speed, became the blueprint for NATO forces during the Cold War. It directly influenced the development of subsequent technologies, such as the beehive round for direct fire against infantry, and ultimately paved the way for the digital fire control systems and precision-guided munitions of today. The modern concept of the deep battle, striking targets dozens of kilometers behind the front lines, has its roots in the corps-level general support fires of the 1940s. For the German soldier at the sharp end, this all translated into a simple, brutal conclusion. He may have held a personal disdain for the individual American infantryman's lack of fieldcraft compared to an Eastern Front veteran. He may have respected the tenacity of the British soldier or feared the relentless mass of the Soviet, but he hated and feared the American artillery more than anything else because it was impersonal, inescapable, and utterly indifferent to his own skill or courage. It was the embodiment of American industrial might brought to bear on the individual soldier. It was not a fight, it was a judgment. And in the end, the judgment was always the same, a storm of steel, a series of blinding flashes, and then nothing.